a few points that I want to make. The first, that there's no basis for this claim that there's some sort of free speech crisis, and I'll go into that a little bit in a second. The second point I want to raise is that there is a difference between the right to speak freely and the right to a platform. And I guess a third point around this freedom of speech angle being pushed in a way that is very selective, and very selective to the narrative that the government wants to push. So kind of starting off with the lack of a basis for this. I really want people to understand that the free speech crisis is very much a manufactured crisis. It's statistically insignificant. If we look at the Office of Students figures, we can see that of around 60,000 events organised in the space of a year with an external speaker in English universities, this was for the academic year of 2019-20, there are 53 that weren't approved. So that's 0.09% of these events being not approved. And for each of those, there are individual reasons, be that security, be that very logistical reasons for why these couldn't be held. In many of the cases where they weren't held, they were actually postponed and moved and changed in order to accommodate. And I do want to stress the fact that this is a statistically insignificant issue. And an issue that's being misrepresented as well. There is this historical narrative about no platforming that perhaps existed when the ministers in question were at university in the 70s and 80s. I mean, I don't understand this idea that when a group of students perhaps invite someone, decides they don't want to hear them talk anymore, and that's being no platform, particularly when the people in question being no platformed have huge platforms and massive columns in some of the biggest newspapers, magazines, online spaces in the country. And I also want to stress that huge amounts of existent work goes into making sure that freedom of speech is upheld at our universities. This is ongoing work that has been embedded for decades to make sure that students have access to bringing speakers to campuses, of course, in less wild times, and to making sure that students can hear from a wide range of speakers, and that's available at universities. So just to really stress it in that kind of first instance, that there isn't a crisis in a very technical sense. There's not a kind of huge issue here, and this is very much a focus coming out of some of the most elite universities where there have been prominent cases, and a willingness to focus on this as a form of distraction from the fact that, you know, over the summer, this government lied to students, ignored scientific advice, lied to students about what was safely possible in order to entrap them paying fees and rent. But that's a whole separate issue, so I won't get too far into that. I guess a second point there around the difference between the right to speak freely and the right to a platform. And I think Nadia was telling her reflections on this on Question Time were really, really important, because it was talking about how the measures that government are seeking to put in place here are going to be emboldening folks who feel like they haven't been given a platform to sue universities, and really questioning where we draw the line with that. And I think to kind of elucidate what's happening here, a considerable number of the speaker events that we're talking about are hosted by democratic student-led societies, and those societies invite speakers based on their mandate. So how do we then separate the right to freedom of expression from the right to students asking to hear what you have to say? And are we then saying that if students don't ask to hear what you have to say, you then have the right to sue the university because you weren't asked to have a platform? Where does this end? So I think that's kind of a crucial marker for me, is a lack of recognition of who is actually holding and hosting these events and inviting these speakers. And I think it's very easy to spin a narrative about no platforming when people maybe don't recognize where those speaker invites and so on are coming from. And then, as I said, that third point around a selectiveness in respect to freedom of speech, because I think this government does want freedom of speech until speech isn't something that they identify with. Because folks may have seen that over the weekend, the university's minister, Michelle Donnellan, made some pretty crude comments about the censoring of history within what she referred to as Britain's Soviet universities. And within those comments, she was denouncing the decolonization of education and talking about what a stain on kind of the curriculum and so on this was. And it actually feels farcical for the government to claim that there's a free speech crisis in one breath and then to critique free speech on the topic of decolonization in the next. And once again, it is a distraction. It's a distraction from everything that's happening to students. The fact that 9% of students have had to access food banks in order to survive this pandemic. The fact that we've got countless students in rent arrears, you know, over 55 universities where students have had to go on rent strike in order to have their demands heard. We've got so many students who are paying for accommodation in this country, but still residing in their country of origin because they haven't been able to get here. This is the situation we're in, and yet this government thinks it's appropriate to be manufacturing a freedom of speech crisis to distract from their inherent failures to protect students, to protect work, and to protect broader communities. And I think it's pretty embarrassing that they would stoop to such a low level of, you know, manufacturing this in a time where there is so much to be dealt with, so much needed policy and investment and so on, and wasting our time bringing forward a free speech champion. And I also want to make the point, I just think that appointing a free speech champion who will dictate what is and isn't free speech is very much a misnomer for me. So I guess just to round up there, the answer is overwhelmingly no. But that doesn't negate the fact that we are very much looking forward to working with government to explain how much actually happens to ensure that freedom of speech is upheld, because, you know, we're doing that all the time, and students' unions are doing that all the time. So I'd very much like to show them the kind of huge swathes of work happening in that regard.